tell you, on Monday, when I started working on my sermon for this week, I looked up the lessons in my calendar and it said Nehemiah. I didn't actually stand up and do a happy dance, but my brain did. This is one of my very favorite lessons in the whole Bible. And it got to be that because I was talking with my wife the other day, and I can't remember when it happened, where I was, or what the event was, but we had a fellow named Robert Benny, B-E-N-N-E, who was a professor of religion and Bible at Roanoke College, did a presentation on this lesson in Nehemiah, and it just blew me away. And then when my son was 18 years old and a senior in high school, and we had the baccalaureate service, I got to preach, and I used this lesson. So yeah, when I sat down and opened my calendar up, it says Nehemiah 8, didn't stand up and do it, but in my mind, I was doing a happy dance. Y'all laugh. But everybody in that choir got a happy dance too. They just don't want you to know. So, we need to get some perspective here so we can understand what this lesson is really all about. So I was thinking the other day, in the ancient history of Israel, there's a lot of famous people. There's Abraham, Isaac, and Noah, and all kind of other folks, King David. But there are only three major events in the ancient history of Israel that are really important. There's the Exodus, when they leave Egypt. There's the exile, when they're carried off to Babylon. And there's the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, in which the Jews were dispersed around the Roman Empire and no longer had a temple in Jerusalem where they could worship. Those are the three big historical events. The fourth one would be the reestablishment of Israel in 1948. That's recent history and not ancient. Where we are in this story of Nehemiah today is at the end of that period we know as the Babylonian exile. When people have returned, and they came with great expectations, and they found some of those expectations did not come to be. They weren't prepared for what they saw when they got back to Jerusalem, which was basically an abandoned city that had been used as a rock quarry by the surrounding farmers. Anytime they needed some rock to build a wall or a pen to keep their sheep in, they went over to Jerusalem and drug some away. They just did. It was easier trying to go out and cut some. And so when the people returned to Jerusalem, life was tough. It was much harder to get things back together and get organized. And so now, in this story in Nehemiah today, we're near the end of that time when things are being put right. And they have this great celebration. They build this huge scaffold out there at the Watergate, and the whole city and surrounding countryside, everybody that's old enough to understand what's going on, gathers there at the break of day one day. And Ezra, who is the priest, Nehemiah, who is the governor, have organized this event as a time of rededication to their faith. And so Ezra the priest brings out the book of the law of Moses. Now, I'm going to tell you the truth. We're not sure what that was. It could have been the whole Pentateuch. I don't know. It could have been just Deuteronomy. But it was something that brought the law of Moses to the people. And you'll note that we jumped around and we didn't read all those verses in the whole chapter. That's called it. You know, places where we jumped with all kinds of these weird, odd names of people, and the people that set this up don't want our lectors to have to stumble off after all those. But I want you to understand what's going on. Here are all these people gathered out in front of this great big scaffold where Ezra is reading the law, and then there's people standing on each side of him. And then there's folks out in the crowd. And he'll read a few verses. And then it begins, and it says there, and they gave the sense of what was read to the people. There are folks going out and they're walking down, just like when I was walking down here in the congregation, I said, do you understand what I said there? You get what that means? So this isn't just reading it in, sentence after sentence after sentence. He reads, he follows. These people disperse through the crowd and make sure everybody understands what's being read, what it means, what the call to action is. And something begins to happen. And we don't get what's beginning to happen until right at the end. This great crowd, if you can imagine, if we took the back wall out, loudspeakers out there, and got all the Lutherans in South Carolina to gather, might throw in a couple of Methodists, Presbyterian, even Baptists. And I was up here preaching, and because I'm the, we had people walking through the crowd trying to explain what I was saying, because I was using all these words and I got to tell you, I've always got a hip pocket full of them. This is what it is. And the people, hearing Ezra read this scripture to them, and hearing it explained by these folks that are wandering through the crowd, making sure everybody understands, because it's important that there is an understanding of what's being read. There's a murmur that runs through the crowd. There are gasps of breath. And people begin to weep. Because they see revealed there for them this gift that God has been giving them through the ages, and their failure to live up to that gift. What God does for them is here. How they've responded is here, and they see that gap in their lives. And they begin to weep. That's understandable. We could be honest. We could do that same thing today. I could be standing up here reading out of the Bible and have people walking around saying, do you understand what this means to you to be? I know a lot. Well, I won't say a lot. It's me and everybody else can find that there are places in our lives where we are not living up to what God teaches us to do. And it might cause us to weep. And then Ezra says the most amazing thing I think we'll ever hear in the Bible, or maybe not the most, but one of the most amazing things in the Bible. He says, stop weeping. Go home. Cook some barbecue. Have a party. Drink a beer. Invite your neighbors over. And rejoice on this day. Because the joy of the Lord is your strength. Wow. The joy of the Lord is your strength. That is an absolute statement of the love of God. God's creatures, God's people. It's saying, Ezra is saying, you have value to God. God's intentions may be here and your accomplishment may be here, God still called you his own. For a lot of years when I would have been sitting down on that stool and doing the children's sermon, I used to tell kids a lot of times that you can't do anything so bad that God will not forgive you and will not love you. And it's something that we need to hear, all of us, no matter how old we are. And this is an absolute statement of God's love for the people of God. Go home, have a party, cook barbecue, drink a beer, invite your neighbors over, share with those that don't have a good meal, and rejoice because God takes delight in you. I'm here to tell you, it just doesn't get any better than that. It really doesn't. Jesus, after having been out in the wilderness and being tempted by Satan, returns and he begins going around to various synagogues in Galilee and preaching. And he finally comes back to Nazareth. You know, it's interesting. You know, sometimes we gloss over words that are written, we don't really think what it means. It says, return to Nazareth, where he grew up. It doesn't say where he lived. He's not living there anymore. He's grown up, he's moved away, he's coming back to his hometown. He goes into the synagogue, and he receives the scroll of Isaiah. Now, I'm sure, it just says, you know, the attendant hands him Isaiah. I don't guess that was by accident. Jesus probably told the attendant, let me have Isaiah. Now, we all know that Isaiah is one of the major prophets, and the reason he's a major prophet, besides what he wrote, is because it's a great big scroll. And y'all may not know this, but we have, you know, the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and then all the rest of those prophets, the minor prophets. It's got nothing to do with the importance of what they had to put in their books. It's got to do with the size of the book. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel all get their own scroll. The rest of them are all on one scroll. They're so short. It's the truth, you know, you can't make stuff like that up. And he takes it and he unrolls it to the place where it says, and I can't remember what it said now, so y'all just have to remember for me. But he says, today in your hearing, these promises of God come true. The sick are healed, the deaf receive hearing, the blind receive sight, and he calls for a year of celebration, which would have been the Jubilee year in Israelite history, the year when debts were canceled. Didn't matter how much you owed, when the Jubilee year came, your debt was canceled. If you had become indentured to pay off a debt, that was canceled. You got to start over again on the Jubilee year. What he's saying is that in your hearing today, all these gifts of God that God has for the people come into being in me. Now, if we are unsure what the joy of the Lord is in you means, all we have to do is look at Jesus that day in the synagogue in Nazareth today. The gifts of God, the prophecies of God, everything that God has ever wanted for you comes into being today in me. God's overwhelming love. We see it in the story of Nehemiah. With Ezra there standing on that big scaffold out in front of the water gate in Jerusalem, with the whole of the city gathered around him, with all of these assistants being able to go out and say, okay, Now you heard that? This is what this means. Jesus sitting in the synagogue, reading the prophecy of Isaiah, which had been 750 years before. Today, in your hearing, this is fulfilled. This comes to be in my person. God never quits loving us. God never quits declaring the love He has for us. God never quits inviting us to live in that relationship of love with God and with others. This is what we mean when we say God is love. It isn't just about, He's this kind of friendly grandfather type that pats us on the head and sends us on our way. He's a God who's involved intimately in the way that we live our lives, who comes in the person of Jesus to be somebody who lives just like one of us, who really is one of us. Gift of God, love, redemption, care. Any other words that we want to use, there is always there for us. And the story of the Bible, over and over again, is not of God saying, well, for you, boy, I like everybody else, but you, I'm not so sure about it. So truthfully, all of us kind of feel like we're that person there that God's not so sure about, okay. But the declaration of God is there's nobody in that group. There's nobody for whom God does not care. Now, we might find people for whom we don't care. Some of us might do that a little too often. But God cares for all of us. That's an unending declaration that God gives us today